Welcome to Sparks of History. We are extremely honored to have with us today Reverend Johnnie Moore. Reverend Moore is a highly accomplished evangelical leader and successful businessman, having founded the KAIROS company, a public relations firm. Reverend Moore is a commissioner for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and president of the Congress of Christian Leaders. Reverend Moore has authored numerous books, including What Am I Supposed to Do with My Life? The Martyr's Oath, 10 Things You Must Know About the Global War on Christianity, Defying ISIS, Preserving Christianity in the Place of Its Birth and in Your Own Backyard, and Dirty God. Reverend Moore, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Just to get started, what are some of the multi-faith endeavors that you and your organizations have undertaken over the years? And how has the October 7th massacre impacted on those efforts?
Well, part of it goes to my own history with the Middle East. My father lived in Saudi Arabia when I was a child, so he was a typical American expatriate recruited to work for the Ford Motor Company, and he would come back from working in the region for a couple of months, home for a couple of weeks, and he would bring me things as a little kid, and it sparked my fascination in that part of the world. And like most evangelicals, I grew up in a church that spoke well about the Jewish people, about the state of Israel. I was in the deep South in South Carolina. I'm not aware I even ever met someone who was Jewish until I was an adult, but it was like built inside of me. And so I had these two sort of identities. My father in the Arab world, working in Saudi Arabia, and as a young evangelical, I loved Israel. I couldn't say why. I didn't quite understand it entirely, but it was built inside of me. So as soon as I was an adult, I started traveling to the Middle East and to all of those countries. And I was at a university. I led students to Israel. Fast forward a few years later, ISIS is ravaging Iraq and Syria. They're putting the Arabic in on the homes of Christians. They're selling children on open slave markets. They're trying to eliminate the Christian community, the Yazidis, and everyone else that stands in their way. And I decided to work on rescuing people, and I did a lot of stuff, to try to get people out of the country and get people in a safe place in Iraq, and help churches in Syria, Christians in all of those places, including evangelicals. With some success, we were able to save a lot of lives. And there was a certain point where, after all of that, and ISIS was sort of in its decline, and we had helped a few tens of thousands of people, and the chaos was moving to another chapter, that I decided I wanted to work on the positive side of it too. So how do we keep these things from happening again? How do we have combat violations of religious freedom, the persecution of Christians, combat anti-Semitism, by making sure that Jews and Christians and Muslims actually know one another? And so I started working on the proactive side. And as I've always done, I believe in the people-to-people relationship. So I just started going to the region, and I would get invitations to visit. I would visit and meet more people, and these concentric circles of relationships began to expand. And there's some very, very interesting stories in there, and some specific achievements that if you want to know, I can tell you. But that's really the big picture. It's part of my lifelong story. I worked on helping people who are being killed by terrorists, and then I started asking myself, how do we create an environment where this is less likely to happen? And then the people-to-people relationships were my way of doing it.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe an example or two of some of the endeavors that you're maybe most proud of, or most, were accomplished, what you think is the most good, or whatever is in the past or even ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much ongoing, but I was the first public Christian to visit Saudi Arabia. to be officially welcomed after the Vision 2030 reforms. I was the first evangelical to meet with the religious police in Saudi Arabia after they were reformed. Lots of firsts. You know, I was a part of a delegation delegations that spent hours with President Sisi and MBZ and King Hamad. Probably what I'm most proud of in all of that was about 2 years before the Abraham Accords. We were a part with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, sort of the Jewish side and we on the Christian side, of leading a peace delegation of Bahrainis to Jerusalem 2 years before the Accords, and it was an amazing series of events. It happened because there was an environment, largely for security reasons, that were introducing different groups to one another. Bahrain, which is this incredibly pluralistic island with a continuous Christian presence for 2,000 years, and the only Hindu temple in the Middle East until the day after tomorrow, as we're talking now, when the United Arab Emirates Abu Dhabi opens a Hindu temple. But the UAE, you know, hundreds of Coptic Christians would travel from Saudi every weekend to worship at churches in the UAE, and the Catholic church was overflowing, the evangelical church was overflowing. The first hospital in Bahrain was started by evangelicals. You know, Bahrain is like this amazing pluralistic country, and you know, Bahrain wanted to make a statement that this mattered, and so we worked with civil society, with an NGO in Bahrain to collaborate with the king on creating something called the King Hamad Declaration for Peaceful Coexistence. It was the first religious freedom document ever authored under the patronage of a king in the Middle East, a Muslim king nonetheless. And we launched that in Los Angeles at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And then afterwards, the king's son was there, and we were talking. We said, if we're serious about this, the next time we meet, we'll meet in Jerusalem. And sure enough, we got word that the king was willing to let these religious leaders travel from Bahrain to Jerusalem. We got in touch with the Israelis; they were willing to welcome them, and we welcomed them in Jerusalem. And it wasn't an easy time. It was exactly, everyone arrived on the third day of rage after the former president announced the moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. So this was not a time where things were you know, in the status quo. This was the single biggest earthquake in a long period of time to the region by the United States. Honestly, I thought the Bahrainis would consider postponing the trip. So much so I canceled my plane ticket. I was just so sure of it. And then I got word that they were coming anyhow. And so I booked another plane ticket, and I met a Bahraini peace delegation in Jerusalem 3 days after the United States announced the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. And that delegation met countless Israelis, and they were able to go, the Muslims were able to go pray in the mosque. And it, in my opinion, was a little known part of history that was quite a consequential moment. Because it's one thing to do all this stuff in private, but when you're walking down the streets with citizens from a country without normalization, and religion was what brought everyone together, I'll always be very, you know, very proud to have been an eyewitness to that. And it just shows, like, many times people are willing to do things if you just ask them, and if trust exists. You know, the most valuable commodity in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf, is not oil or gas. It's trust. There's no business without trust. There's nothing without trust. And for lots of reasons, over a period of time, trust had been built with Bahrain, and it produced a tiny little country connected by a bridge to Saudi Arabia, was willing to defy the entire world, sending a peace delegation 3 days after the announcement of the move of the embassy. And I almost can't think of a more righteous action.
Absolutely fantastic. I think you may have answered this in part. There's sometimes a sense that there's a refrain that says um, leaders, people of influence, are more moderate than they appear in public or what they can publicly say. So, what needs to be done? Let's say, just from the perspective of moderate Muslim leaders, what needs to be done so that they could feel freer to speak out and be heard in these multi-faith endeavors of reconciliation?
Well, first of all, the word you just used is the most important word. It's the word multi. You actually used two words that I think are the most important words. The one word is multi-faith. I always say that I don't do interfaith work. I do multi-faith work because interfaith really doesn't. I mean, I don't judge those who use the term. People use it with different meanings, but for my, the conventional wisdom when it comes to interfaith work is that you have to lay down your sincerely held religious beliefs in order to find a common ground. And I just don't think that gets us very far. I think we have to have people who know that they don't have to lay down their sincerely held religious beliefs and their cultural, religious, whatever identities, and yet we can still collaborate together. So I prefer the term multi-faith, and I often talk about an evangelical concept called co-belligerency that was popularized by a theologian named Francis Schaeffer, who got it from another theologian whose name was Carl Henry, who founded Christianity Today. Is one of the founders, the founding editor of Christianity Today. And co-belligerency is this idea of we can disagree on everything, but if we agree on this one thing, we can work together. And there are limits to all of that, and there are levels of complexity. But I think the first thing is these are societies with sincerely held religious beliefs in some circumstances, but certainly cultural norms, that have to be respected. Cultural norms about honor, respect, and shame, and all of these things as well. And I think very, very often in the West, I would say habitually in the State Department, people think that because they are multilingual, that somehow they understand culture. And I think I think you can not be multilingual and you can understand culture when it comes to things like honor and shame, and strength and respect, and these things. So the multi-faith part, and the second one, which just sort of leads to it, is leadership. I mean, when it's all said and done, people can make peace with their peers across divides, but it takes leaders to make the decisions. I always say people to people peace is a prerequisite for government to government peace that sustains, but ultimately the governments have to make decisions. And I think when it's all said and done, it really comes down to leadership. It comes down to Anwar Sadat getting on an airplane and going to the Knesset, and it comes down to Golda Meir joking with him in that famous press conference afterwards, as she gave him a gift for the birth of his grandchild. These were two strong leaders who fought an incredible war, and they would have fought to the last, to the end of it. And yet, those same strong leaders, I always say, it takes hawks to make peace. Doves don't make peace. It takes leadership, and sometimes an individual can be a globally influential leader. You just have to do what other people haven't done before, and don't believe all the lies. But I think when it's all said and done, leaders sometimes leaders overestimate the risk of taking actions, and they underestimate the risk of not taking action. And I think that has been the story of the challenges in the Middle East. People are so worried about the risks of doing what they in their heart of hearts know is the rational thing to do, and in the end, they actually realize those very risks. And so far, I can't think of a single example where strong principled leaders took sort of morally centered correct actions based upon common sense that weren't enduring. I can think of plenty of examples where people were trying to play the middle and make everyone happy and take no position on anything, where the stronger people took a position. And religion is a big part of that. Religion is often the X factor in all of these circumstances. In failed states, religious leaders are often the only people with any moral authority whatsoever. Some of the worst actors in history have figured out that they can weaponize religion to suspend all rationality. And when religion is baked into the cake, it can be a blessing. When the religious factors are discounted, neglected, avoided, they more often than not can be a curse. And so I think it takes when people to people relationships, leaders, and people have to know they can be who they are, as opposed to changing who they are or what they believe.
Shifting just a little bit from the Middle East to the United States, what is your take, Reverend Moore, on what appears to be an alarming rise of anti-Semitism, especially on certain college campuses? What can be done? What should be done to combat this?
Everything should be done. I mean, I think this is not a time in history where you hedge your bets. This is a time in history where you make principled decisions. I mean, what happened at the universities is just absolutely astonishing on the one hand, but absolutely obvious on the other hand. Everyone was watching this slow creep take place, but people were unwilling to recognize it for what it was. And I think, I spent the beginning of my career in higher education. I spent a lot of time interacting with universities even till now, and I can tell you, universities can change, but it takes strong boards appointing strong presidents who they will not fire when they have to do the hard and controversial things. And so far, that's not what's happening. And on the contrast, what happened is a lot of bad actors all around the world through transparent means and through subversive means realized that the easiest way to get to the heart of American democracy and American power was through the next generation. It's a lesson as religious people. We know, like, if you don't pass the faith to the next generation, then they won't know the faith of their fathers, the grandfathers. It'll all go away over time. And worse is that middle ground where there's still a religious culture, but there aren't any principles, and then you cause chaos, in every direction. And unfortunately, what happened here, I think, is ideology was passed down through transparent and through subversive means to a whole generation of elite leaders that occupy our institutions. And we should have learned the lessons of history now. And the only way out of it is to recognize it all for what it is. And, it's sort of this weird thing between the evangelical community and the Jewish community around the world and in the United States, because what's sort of interesting here in the U.S. is evangelicals are often staunch supporters of Israel, staunch advocates for the Jewish community. They feel good about the Jewish community, but many evangelicals are just learning the term anti-Semitism. It's unbelievable. They're not it's not a term. I don't recall ever hearing the term. I knew about the Holocaust. I knew that people irrationally hated the Jewish community, but it's not a vocabulary word I grew up with in the evangelical community. And yet, of course, as an adult, I know plenty of things about anti-Semitism, but I think it's a reflection of the lack of a relationship between the Jewish community and the evangelical community in the United States. Like, we should be learning as evangelicals the Christian history of anti-Semitism through our Jewish neighbors. They should be teaching us. And evangelicals are generally mortified when they learn about those things. But it seems in the United States, the Jewish community, the evangelical community have sort of been on this parallel path, and they don't really know each other. except when there are sort of concentric political circles that occasionally intersect. Since October 7th, I would say that has been changing. I think what's happening is, probably 10% of the rally in Washington, D.C., the largest such gathering ever, were evangelical Christians. In all of these micro rallies to support the Jewish community in the United States, there have been evangelical Christians. The largest churches in America have been hosting family members of those held by hostages. I led a rally in Geneva outside of the Red Cross, 2 weeks after October 7th. The crowd was entirely 90% Christian, with the local Jewish community came, but it was a Christian rally in support of I spoke at the EU Parliament on October 9th or 11th, and that was an event organized by Christian Friends of Israel there. And so I think we have this in the United States. It's not so the case, by the way. I think in Europe, Latin America, and Africa, the Jewish community and the Christian community tends to know one another better. Less so in Europe, certainly in South America, and where it exists in Africa. But in the United States, we've had this parallel path, and I think since October 7th, that's changing. We have to continue to change it. And I think my dear Jewish friends need to remember that when Theodor Herzl gathered the first Zionist World Conference, I mean, he had in Basel, Switzerland, as his personal guests, 10 or 12 Christian friends. The term Christian Zionist was not invented by Christians. It was invented by Theodor Herzl to try to describe people like Heckler and Donat, who were his evangelical Christian friends who supported the Zionist cause. Donat, for goodness sakes, was the founder of the Red Cross, the recipient of 2 Nobel Prizes. He was a Christian Zionist. Like, somehow we have been in this journey from the very, very beginning, and yet we have a lot to learn about our own Christian history when it comes to anti-Semitism. But I also think, with due respect to all my Jewish friends, and I probably have more Jewish friends than Christian friends these days. The Jewish community has well, let me say it this way. A month ago, I sat in the home of the president of Israel, President Herzog, right. Just me and him, and I said, it may feel like 1938, but it isn't 1938, at least for one reason, and that is there are 700 million of us around the world, and we're not always good at articulating it, and we may disagree on all kinds of other things. Last I checked, the Jewish community has no problem disagreeing with each other, so this is okay. We have a lot to learn from one another, but we intend on building a Christian firewall around the Jewish community all around the world, wherever they are. And the Jewish community, the state of Israel, is strong. You probably don't need us, but we're going to make sure that if they're going to try to get to you, they're going to get through us first. And I think that is something that's different. That's different now. And in history, I mean, there were Maimonides, right? I mean, he said it was okay to study the Bible with Christians. You couldn't go to a church, but it was okay to study the Bible with Christians. And I think one of the things I found is when I can get Christians studying the Hebrew Bible together with the Jewish community, it unlocks so many things in the Christian heart. Things that we didn't learn in our churches and seminary because we don't speak Hebrew, and there were selected decisions made about translation, and there's just so much that's also exciting about this terrible moment.
Well, what's next on the horizon? It sounds, I often ask guests, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or somewhere in between? You strike, Reverend Moore, a very optimistic note, which is wonderful. I mean, it's inspirational, and it gives us strength here in Israel when we hear this. What's next on the horizon? Where do you see things going if you look into your crystal ball, after the conclusion, hopefully successful conclusion of this war?
Well, I think first of all, as people of faith, we have to really pray. I mean, we are in a perilous moment in history. I mean, you can draw the line of coups across the center of Africa. No one's talking about 17 million people, displaced in Sudan. We have in effect, a piecemeal caliphate forming in the west of Africa. We have great power competition with, I would say, with sometimes less rational actors with much more dangerous technology. We have wars in multiple parts of the world. Like, we are not from a global perspective. This can go either way, and I think we ought to be leading our congregations, people of faith all around the world ought to be praying very, very intensely for God to bless us with leaders around the world, and to protect us from ourselves, and to make sure that we're not forced to repeat the lessons of history, because we are at a very, very perilous place right now. And the status quo among so many of the elites in the world seems to be that you can buy off evil in various ways, and it makes sense if you don't believe in good and evil, so you're always making deals. But if you do believe in good and evil, you do believe that there's certain things that are evil, and certain people can do evil things, and this is a prerequisite for any moral clarity whatsoever. And what October 7th demands is moral clarity. What this moment of history demands is moral clarity. And we should have moral clarity in droves, because we're a very religious world. Unfortunately, our status quo seems to have been built for a previous time, and there are a lot of people fighting a previous generation's wars. And so we have to really, really be prayerful. In terms of what's next, I am an optimist. I have to be. But I do believe, aside from the fact that Israel will decidedly win this war, and Israel will be further respected in a region that requires respect for coexistence, and there are all kinds of complexities there. I think Israel needs to do a better job of reminding the broader Arab world that the majority of aside from 20% of Israel being non-Israeli, the majority of the Jews in Israel come from to some degree from Arab countries. They were 800,000 people exiled, and this is why when I sit with Yemenite Jewish friends or Iraqi Jewish friends, some Moroccans, I sometimes feel like I'm in the Middle East. There's so many cultural connections. The internet doesn't allow the bad guys to separate people as they used to, right? Information is everywhere. But what comes next is Israel wins. Israel must win as quickly as possible, but Israel must not be rushed. And when Israel wins as quickly as possible, even though it's not being rushed, then I think I absolutely believe that the winds of peace are still blowing in the right direction. I do believe there will be normalization with the Saudis. I absolutely believe that the Arab countries in the region will be partners in problem solving, which, by the way, didn't exist before October 7th to the same degree, because I think people thought the situation was more stable than it was. I think everybody did. But post October 7th, the post October 7th reality requires certain problems to be solved, and I think that there's greater trust now between whether that's public or private, between the Israelis and between Arab countries, and that is also demonstrated by the patience Israel is having with some of the less patient statements coming from their Arab neighbors. But I think there's a lot else that's going on in that. And one thing is sure, the people of Israel will live, Israel will continue to thrive in the Middle East. And all of those countries, when they become one integrated whole, will be not only an economy to be reckoned with that rivals Europe, but it will be something for much celebration. History tells us in the aftermath of most of these existential moments, we actually generally have the needle of peace and security moved in a positive direction. And so it's a matter of whether leaders are willing to lead. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah. Reverend Moore, thank you so much. This has been inspirational, fascinating, and you should continue to go from strength to strength in all of your efforts and all of your endeavors. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ari.